talk is called Bags of Rocks and Sleeper Graveyards, Stabilising the Cumbria Coast, and it's being given by Chris Milne from Murphy. Chris is a chartered geologist, chartered civil engineer and UK registered ground engineer and advisor with over 25 years experience working in railway earthworks assessment and remediation. Having been technical lead for railway geotechnics in large consultancies, he is now a senior engineering manager for Murphy, working as CEM for earthworks for the Network Rail Anglia CP6 framework, with responsibility for developing UK railway earthworks best practice. So over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Holly. Well, thanks everybody for joining me today. The purpose of this talk really was sort of suggested by Stuart Fielder and I are working on CP6 in Anglia, and we got talking about jobs that I'd worked on in the past in other areas of the country, and I started to talk about the sleeper graveyard on the Cumbria Coastline, and Stuart was sufficiently interested to hear all about this. We thought it might be a useful exercise to run through some of the work which I was involved in from between about 2007 to about 2014 with Murphy up on the Cumbria Coastline. It's a neck of the woods that many of you probably don't know very much about, and in fact it's a neck of the woods that people in Cumbria don't know very much about because it's quite an unusual and slightly remote part of the world. It's very close to the Lake District, but quite different from it. So I'm going to sort of start off with a brief introduction to Murphy for those of you who don't know about it. Murphy is obviously a major infrastructure contractor in the UK, but also in Ireland and in Canada. We've got about 3,500 people working across those countries, and we turned over about £1 billion last year, so a big company. And we've had we've just had our 70th anniversary, founded in 1951. In the UK, so it's quite a big year. And one of the features of one of the sort of key elements of what we do is obviously railway work, and what you can see there is a scheme that we're involved in on the Cumbria Coastline quite recently, so slightly after my time, and that kind of illustrates some of the issues which we're going to talk about in terms of the interaction between the railway line, the coast, coastal stability issues. So I'm going to run through a brief safety moment, which we always like to do in these kind of presentations. I'm going to talk about what the Cumbria Coastline is, where it goes from, what it's about, what its history is. I'm going to talk about the geology and geomorphology, and then run on to some of the challenges, the ongoing works, and then talk about two specific schemes, Part and Bag of Rocks and the Sleeper Graveyard. It's very much a personal view. It's my involvement during the time I was working on that area. It's some time ago, so I won't necessarily be able to recall every last detail of what went on, and certainly in terms of a detailed description of the geology of that neck of the woods, it won't be, partly because there are many people who are more qualified to talk about it probably than I am, and partly because there's only so much time anyway to talk about it. But if we just jump on briefly to a safety moment, that's right, Sandy, noise in the background. This is a personal issue of mine, that personal sort of hobby horse that Stuart's obviously, I'm sure, aware of, which is the issue of crest drainage, and you'll see the importance of that as we go through the slide. Crest drainage sounds like it doesn't sound like a fundamental issue, putting a drain at the top of a cutting slope, but this is an example from Calderton, which I was involved with, major emergency works job caused by effectively the lack of crest drainage at the top of the slope. So water was coming down what looks like a fairly gentle sort of slope, and there was just this concentration point here, and then water cascading over that washed out the glacial deposit slope below it, blocking the railway line, in fact trapping 2 trains in the process. A major issue really, just because of the lack of crest drainage. And it's a resilience issue really. We're increasingly going to get these kind of events, these extreme events. It's not really about how we design our drainage in terms of how big we put our pipes or ditches at the top, because we don't design those for return periods of 100-year event or whatever, and that event could happen tomorrow. What happens when we get that kind of event? What are we actually making the situation worse if we don't allow for overflow mechanisms, etc., in our crest drainage? So just a point to think about before we go on, and perhaps bear in mind as we look at some of these schemes. So the Cumbria Coastline, as its name suggests, runs along the west coast of Cumbria. I actually live down here in Arnside, so I see the trains going past pretty much every day. It opened quite early in the history of railways, 1837. And the reason for that is because this area of the world is actually pretty remote, unsurprisingly, but it's remote even in Lake District terms. There aren't really any routes across the country that are substantial routes. So the only real route round this part of the Cumbria is round the edge, so either by road or in those days by rail. And it was built primarily to support the industry at that time, so coal, iron ore, steel, chemicals, which were big industries. And the port of Barrow was the largest exporter of iron ore for a long period of time in Victorian times, so it was a big industry. Obviously, that has declined significantly since then, though there is, as you probably know, plans afoot to start coal mining again. A lot of the coal working is actually extended out under the sea. And then lately, there's been a nuclear industry at Sellafield, so that the railway line is used for weights trains and also significantly for transporting workers from Barrow up to Sellafield, and then likewise for transport for the nuclear shipyards. And having sort of two lines in and out, two routes to get in and out of those places to Sellafield and Barrow is strategic, and it's one of the reasons why the line is maintained, though obviously also to provide a link to what are otherwise quite remote parts of the world. There's only about 9 or 10 trains running a day from Carlisle to Barrow. There's some that sort of go into intermediate stations, and consequently it's a single bi-directional line in parts. It was once twin track all the way, and it's pretty low speed, and that sort of helps in some ways for working on the railway, but there are many other challenges, as you can see. So this area up here, Harrington Parton, is sort of the area which we're going to slightly concentrate on today. There have been works all the way along this line, and you'll see examples from other areas, but just bear in mind it's sort of we're primarily talking about that part of the world. And if we look at an example of what this was like in 1900, you can see that whilst Parton is quite today and was then not particularly big place, quite a small sort of large village really, there was a lot of industry. There was a foundry, there was a colliery, and you can see that Whitehaven nearby was quite a busy port, lots of coal ships coming in and out. And it's quite hard to sort of correlate that busy industrial history with what you see at the moment. So when you look at, can somebody mute themselves? There's a bit of cluttering around. Sorry. When we look at the coast today, we can see that, there is, there is a legacy of past industry, but it isn't at all obvious. So if you look at the village of Parton down here, it doesn't look like an industrial area at all. In fact, this area here is in fact a huge coal tip, but you wouldn't really know that when you look at it. And now there is the future of what's described as the energy coast. So you can see wind turbines up here and nuclear, obviously. But it remains its own place. There are certainly very odd sort of features about it that you don't see anywhere else. So these houses, and there are several of them, lots of them, are literally built on the shore, and people live there. These aren't holiday homes. People are living there all year. And where this track is here, that is the route by which you drive to your property. You have to have a 4-wheel drive. In fact, when we were there, somebody got stuck and we had to pull them out. So it's quite an unusual place. And as a consequence, there are lots of challenges. I mean, one of the obvious ones is nature. The Irish Sea is a very exposed coastline. You wouldn't necessarily think it. You think, well, it's not the North Sea, it's not the Atlantic, but it's incredibly exposed up there. And these shots, when I was going through, it was quite difficult to find times when it wasn't pouring with rain and the camera shots were smeared with water on the lens, etc. Because obviously I was going up there during times when the weather was poor because of emergency works. But these are all examples of things that happened in a single month. I mean, in a very short space of time, big storm. We've got major collapses and damage to sea walls, washout events on the. This is actually a rock slope, but nevertheless, washout events affecting the line. You'll see examples of this further on, where basically a seawall collapsed and took away the railway line. And this is an example of one of these houses we was talking about. In fact, I'd been speaking to the owners a few weeks before and talking about whether they were concerned about the the fact that storms could come up and damage their property, and they had said, "Oh no, it never happens. We've never had any issues with the weather." Well, obviously that wasn't quite the case. And then there's the broader sort of environmental issues. It is obviously you know, an environmentally sensitive area. There are triple SIs, there are Ramsar sites, there are dunes, and consequently natterjack toads associated with those, and shore nesting birds. There are protected marine habitats, there are soft corals out just in shallow depth. There are protected fisheries, multiple consents with marine organisations, as you can imagine, to do any works on the foreshore. And there are multiple landowners, including the Crown. So it's tricky to organise works from that perspective. And the location itself is obviously pretty challenging. It's a railway environment, so as anyone who works on a railway knows, that's not easy to organise. There's lots of rules and regulations we have to follow for safe working on the railway. It's a foreshore environment, so there is tidal working. So you can see some guys working there. This is on a culvert job, and you've got to work around the tides, and you've got to make sure that you can work safely, which is tricky. It's very exposed, so when the weather gets bad, you literally can't work sometimes just because of the amount of water and you know, and wind, etc. And it's remote. There is no practical road access to most places. So a lot of places you're either having to come along the line, or if you're lucky, there might be an access track along the railway line, or you're coming along the foreshore. So quite tricky. There are sea walls you've got to get over and deal with. There are not necessarily good access points to the railway where you can get vehicles on and off. Signals are quite remote because they don't need to have many signals because there's only, in some cases, bi-directional lines. And there's a lack of mobile coverage. So trying to organise yourself around all those is difficult. And then there's the asset condition. The railway line, as you can see there, was built on the easiest place to build it, which was basically along the top of the foreshore at the bottom of these sea cliffs. It seemed like, you know, the best option at the time. And remember, like a lot of railway lines, it was built purely for economic purposes. It wasn't built to be there in 100 years' time. It was built to deal with the industrial needs of the time of the next 20, 30 years. And so it's a Victorian asset. The materials that make it aren't great. So in places there is slag concrete, which means it's not very durable at all. The masonry, as we'll see later, is a weak sandstone. It's an exposed, very aggressive environment, so physically and chemically, so that's not good for any kind of structure. And it's built on very unstable ground, so foreshore environment, coastal cliffs, all tricky things and all affecting the asset condition. So just a few examples there. We can see here, this is slag concrete on the seawall and Siddick, and this is the effect of having slag concrete. It's a storm, it had come down, it's unreinforced, very poor condition, it collapsed, and then obviously the railway line was exposed behind it. A lot of the masonry, most of the masonry is St. Bees sandstone, which we'll talk about in a bit, which is a pretty weak sandstone. It's very convenient to use because it's easy to cut and shape, but it doesn't stand up to the battering of the sea. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of the Victorian sort of structure with this skin of masonry, it can easily collapse. So small cracks, small voids open up. The force of water and the air associated with that being pumped in by the waves basically blows out the front of this masonry facing. So you get some quite dramatic damage to the seawalls, these Victorian seawalls. So if we come on to the geology, I've chosen intentionally a pretty ye olde map of the geology, but the geology for this talk, for the purpose of this talk, is quite simple. The underlying geology is basically along the coast either coal measures material or is St. Bees sandstone, perma-Triassic St. Bees sandstone. And neither of those deposits are particularly competent, and that causes a lot of issues. On top of that, you've got made ground of various types, so slag associated with the steel industry, the iron ore smelting industry, mine spoil, landfill deposits of various descriptions. Then you've got natural drift deposits of beach materials, blown sand, and then glacial deposits, which are basically till, a very sandy till, largely derived from the St. Bees sandstone. Which doesn't help in terms of its ability to resist being washed out. So the coal measures material that forms part of the wave cut platform. You can see dipping strata there. There are some quite nice fossils in it, incidentally, because obviously you get some nice calamites fossils which you can see on the beach, plant fossils, which are quite fun to collect. But from a slope stability point of view, it's not great because you've either got sort of blocks of sandstone, which you can easily just ravel out and roll out onto the track, and then you've got this weathering, weak, weathered mudstone behind it, which can either ravel off or come down as small translational failures, or sometimes there are deeper slope failures within that weak material. So that's not great. And the St Bees sandstone, it's generally pretty much exposed only as this sort of wave cut platform, though there is quite a pronounced feature at St Bees Head, hence the name St Bees sandstone, which is quite attractive. But it's quite a weak material again. It erodes to this relatively even sort of platform, and you can see that underneath the seawall there, it's become very easily eroded out, and the concrete you can see has been poured in in an attempt to basically shore up the seawall above, which again is made of St Bees sandstone, so also isn't weathering particularly well. And the glacial deposits, as I say, are very sandy. So this sort of sandy till is typical, often very red, like the St Bees sandstone, and these are all washouts where it's been exposed onto the on the sea cliffs by the foreshore. So again, not a great material from a stability point of view. And then in terms of made ground, we've got typically landfill type deposits. So this is a part in this coal tip, so you can see you can't really tell, but the whole of this is a landfill, and you can see this ochreous sort of layer here, and there's some nasty ochreous seepages coming out of that. And then over on this side at Harrington, this is actually a cliff of slag. So in Victorian times, it was quite common to simply tip the slag and tip it out into the sea and form these cliffs of slag, which at a distance look like rock, like limestone, but in fact are significant deposits of slag with all the problems associated with that. In terms of the geomorphology, it's pretty much as you might expect. So in the front, there's a wave cut platform. There are then beach deposits of sand and shingle and cobbles. Then there are areas of dunes and blown sand, and behind that there are sea cliffs, like you can see here, sort of Pleistocene to recent deposits, usually of this sandy glacial till. And within those sea cliffs there are then deep and shallow failures, including failures which occur within the weak rock, ranging from recent times, which is what you can see here, all the way to geological age, fairly significant failures. So again, this is this Calderton slip, which I started off looking at. So this is the area where water had come down, washed out right all the way along the foreshore, took away the support underneath the railway line. This train was stuck, realised what was going on ahead. Another train was brought in to try and rescue the passengers, and that got stuck in another landslide. And that kind of situation was quite common. I almost got stuck myself once going down to look at one of these sites, and then was unable to get out, to drive back out of where I'd come down because there was so much water and so much coming onto the road. So it's a tricky part of the world when it gets bad. So as a consequence of those sort of fairly regular storm events, there is a lot of ongoing work, and that usually is repairs of one kind or another. So these are repairs of the sea defences, these Victorian sea defences, so and areas where of including areas of concrete repair need to be dealt with one way or another. So up here, this is breaking out the existing concrete and then putting in stainless steel reinforcement, and then over the top of that marine grade fibre reinforced concrete or spray concrete. Everything has to be of a very high spec, and likewise this is again this fibre reinforced concrete repair. Tricky to do because you've got tidal working to consider, so you can put this material down, and if you're unlucky the tide comes in and washes some of it away, so it's not easy to do. Like, this is quite an example of the kind of repairs that have to be done from time to time. Where possible, a better alternative is often to put down rock armour, because unlike a sea wall, it's going to absorb the energy of the waves as they hit it, and it's a bit more maintainable in many ways, because even if individual rocks become dislodged, you can put them back in place again. it's quite a skilled, you might not seem like it, but it's actually quite a skilled thing to do. So you start off by putting down a heavy duty filter underneath it, so that prevents stuff from being washed out underneath the rock. But then you need quite a skilled machine operator to form this profile. So this isn't just rocks piled up, which you often see. It's actually forming quite a relatively even profile for the size of the blocks, and that's quite important. And they're interlocked together in a way that they're not going to come out from one another. And that requires skilled operators, and the guys working up there are very good at doing that. There's a practical size of block, really, which is about 6 tons, which is pretty much all you can move. So whilst the size of the blocks is determined by the wave energy, in reality, 6 tons is about all you can ever put down. You just can't physically get it there and place it in these remote situations. And you've got to work on the tidally. You've got to move the stuff along the foreshore, as you can see there, and it's quite tricky. So again, takes a long time, requires much more skill than you think. And then there's a lot of drainage work. So we talked about this as resilience issues, trying to look at ways in which you can put in overflows or ditches like this, which are going to capture material which overwhelms the drain beneath, to make things more resilient to the extreme events that we're getting. Stabilization works generally often comprise sort of emergency works, really just to patch up the slopes with a suitable robust material. And up though that part of the world, this 6G, 6B material, so a coarse rock fill material, is fairly easy to obtain. It's a good solution because it doesn't require compaction, and it's much more resistant to being washed out from rainfall events. So there's a lot of rock fill repairs. So let's just talk about some of the specific jobs that we talked about, Parton, and then go on to the sleeper graveyard. This was a site which was stabilised in 2009. It was a 40-metre long, 17-metre high, shallow transformational failure in weathered coal measures, and it had been retained up until that point by passive rockfall mesh, so the Maccaferry mesh that you see all the time on rock slopes. Except, of course, the material coming down wasn't really just rock; it was weathered rock, soil, etc. And it had been there for a while, and it had now built up into this into a quite tricky situation. You can see it's bulging, and it wasn't clear how that material could be released in order to prevent the whole thing from coming down. So it got its name because if you look at it here, somebody decided that it looked like an enormous paunch in a string vest, and they described it as a bag of rocks. It looked like as it says, a bag of rocks, which is quite interesting. I mean, it shows the capacity of this old style hexa mesh, Maccaferry type mesh. It's carrying a lot of material, and you would think if you were designing this, well, that's great, I can allow for enormous blocks to be supported in it, but you have to remember that material would be built up over a long period of time, and it's quite small in size, so the energy of each of those tiny bits and pieces coming down into it was quite low. So that's the reason it was able to accumulate in that way. If that amount of material came down in one go, particularly if it was in a big sharp block, it would just cut through the mesh and have collapsed onto the line. But fortunately, that hadn't happened. But there was a tricky task, as you can see there. We needed to remove this material and then install a better solution behind it. And obviously, if we'd simply gone along and cut along the bottom of that mesh, for example, or cut one of the retaining wires, there was a possibility the whole thing would come down right on top of whoever was working beneath. So there was a lot of scratching of heads as to how we were going to do this. We had a design, but the design assumed we'd be able to remove this material. The solution was going to be to replace all of this with a system designed to deal with these shallow translational failures that were going on. And that was to use this tension techo mesh, Geodude techo mesh, with an erosion matting between it and a whole series of anchors 4 to 6 meters long, which would then be tensioned into it and hopefully retain the shallow soil and prevent this material from moving in that way again. And that was a scheme that was designed by Scott Wilson, now AECOM. So that's great. All had to be stainless steel, obviously, because we're dealing with this very aggressive marine environment. So the first thing we had to do really was to install anchorages along the top of the slope so that we could then run the new mesh down over the face once we'd cleared off an area beneath it. So this is the subcontractor vertical axis, and they're up on these sled-mounted rigs drilling these top anchorages. The track is here, which is open. There was fortunately an access track running along here, so we had a bit of room to play with. And then we installed these concrete jersey barriers. So this work was all done while the track was open. That was fine. But then we had to think about removing how we were going to remove the material in order to put that in place. So this is the stainless steel Teco mesh. It's like a chain link type mesh if you haven't seen it before. This was the first time it had been used in stainless. It was quite expensive, very expensive, had to be ordered specially. And there were some advantages because unlike the Macapherry type mesh, when you trim it, you can actually weave sections back in again. So you can sort of thread through one of these one section of wire to join two together, which is obviously what we did because it was very expensive. So there were some advantages in securing it together, and it has a quite neat system. It uses little links that you can use to connect it together. So yeah, it was good in many ways, but it's much stiffer than Macapherry mesh, so it was a bit more tricky. So what we had to do was to take off sections of the mesh, of the old mesh, regrade the face, and then install the new mesh. So what you can see is working at night with a demolition machine at the bottom. So this is a long reach machine with this reinforced cab. Nobody at the bottom, of course. And then the guys on ropes were coming down. They were cutting the mesh at a safe point above it. And then the machine was pulling the mesh off and raking the material down. Now, as you can imagine, the first time we did this, we imagined it would just go ping and suddenly all fall down to the bottom. So everybody was waiting for this to happen. But in fact, when we cut the mesh, it had welded itself together. It was so clayey, it just formed a hard lump. And in fact, we had to scrape it down. So just as well, but we prepared for the fact that it could all come tumbling down. So we had a process of cutting and regrading this material. And here you can see a section that's been regraded, and then a section where during the day installing the anchorages, putting in this mesh, and underneath it this sort of browny green erosion matting, and we worked our way progressively over the site. So at night doing the regrading work, during the day putting in the anchorages and the mesh. This is there was like a wheel axle which they were using to unroll the mesh down on the end of this long reach, which was quite neat, and that worked quite well because it's, as I say, it's stiff material, quite heavy, so it was difficult to handle from that point of view, but that worked quite well. And then that was the finished slope. So this is the area that's all been regraded off. Underneath here, you can see the weathered mudstone beneath it, and quite a neat and tidy job. So the second site I want to talk about is the famous sleeper graveyard. Sadly, this is no more. It was a bit of it was one of those places that if you worked on the Cumbria Coastline, where everybody knew about the sleeper graveyard. And basically, because it's a remote part of the world, and because it was difficult to ship materials in and out, it had been decided at one stage or another that it might be a good idea just to tip all the old concrete sleepers over the edge of the railway line, and thereby get rid of them, and secondly, provide a bit of a sort of sea defence, bearing in mind that what you can see here is actually the end of an enormous slope failure, which I'll illustrate shortly. But unfortunately, it's not a stable arrangement. It was obviously moving and subject to attack from the waves. So the plan was to come in and replace this with a much more robust sea defence, rock armour, but tricky because, as you can see there, this is a bit like I said at the time. It's a bit like the old game Jack Straws, where you had to pull out straws from a pile of material without causing the whole thing to collapse, because how would we do this without destabilizing the slope above or having all these sleepers come tumbling down on top of this? So you can see this is again an area sort of just a bit north of where Parton Bag of Rocks is, not just a bit south of Harrington really. There was sort of a line of sleepers up front which provide a sort of toe that they put in and piled up all these sleepers behind, and then the railway line runs on top, and this slope behind was all moving. So if I show you a photo there, that's a metre rule. This is the front end of this pile of sleepers. Very tricky to understand how we were going to remove it all. So it was actually pretty large and complex failure, which extended right back into the rock. So you can see these are all failure surfaces within a rock head, basically. So you've got weathered mudstone extending quite close to surface, so a thin layer of glacial material, and then this big pile of sleepers and all the rest of it in front of it. And the concern was removing, well, not shoring up the front end of that, the toe of that feature would cause it to move even further and destabilize. There wasn't any practical opportunity to stabilize this feature. It was too enormous. Somebody's gone off mute, I think. This is just a section. That was a section by ACOM who'd done the original work on this. This was some work that I did for Hyde and Arcadis, looking at the feasibility, and that's just the profile showing that there was some area of rock armour, then there was this big pile of sleepers, and then up onto the track. And again, this is the track running through here. This is the slope behind here. This is this sort of lobe of various rock armour and sleepers that we were talking about trying to remove. So it had to be done quite carefully and sequentially. We had to basically remove the sleepers progressively and then progressively put in place a rock armour toe. The rock armour was 3 ton to 5.5 ton stone. So again, just below this 6 ton limit that I was talking about before. And then the embankment immediately above that was regraded. Now all of that had to be done tidily. So you can see there's there's some working being done at night because we had to work with the tides, and the tides aren't just during the day, obviously. So trying to get as many shifts in as we can during the period. And that's the completed rock armour, replacing all this nasty sleepers, so much more stable. And remember, bearing in mind this is an area of public access, so again, big piles of loose, unstable sleepers, not great from that point of view. And you can see here the filter, the thick filter material underneath to prevent it from the material behind being washed out. And then that's the finished embankment above. This is Geodude material to be seeded. There's the track. This is the rock armour there to replace all the sleepers. So nice job, and much better to look at, much more stable from the railway's point of view, and much better from a public access point of view, bearing in mind that it is surprisingly used area by local fishermen and what have you. It's odd how many people actually go there though from the local area. And then finally, really just to say that this is work that Murphy is still involved in. This is after my time. I wasn't involved in this, but it was a job that was done in 2019 and won an award from the SECA, for the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. And you can see all the features that we've been talking about. Firstly, we've got the wind farms on the top of the slope. So this is the future, and obviously a concern for the stability of the slope. You can see there's an overflow mechanism. So there's a flume here, which is intended to deal with any overwhelming of the crest drainage. There are crest drainage behind. There are counterforts to drain the slope. There's a big area of rock fill to drain the bottom, support the bottom of the slope. And you can see here there's actually a rock slope at the bottom which has got spray concrete on it. So you've got the full cycle, full range of things that tend to be done to the slopes in that neck of the woods. So it's a perpetual job. It's a bit like painting the Forth Bridge. It will go on forever and ever, and it certainly is an experience to work up there that if you have worked up there, it's, you don't forget it. So I'm just going to, before we get to questions, just run through a few acknowledgements. First of all, to acknowledge the Murphy construction teams were involved in that. My involvement was very much on the design and only to a certain extent on the supervision, and there's some very skilled people who've worked on that, both planning and undertaking the works, who need to get the credit for that. Too many to call out. But also it was done very much as part of a team, both with designers like we talked about ACOM and Arcadis and JBA, but also subcontractors like Vertical Access and Network Rail's RAM team and project team. So very much the success in all those jobs was the team involvement. And finally, just to give a bit of a shout out to my partner in crime in those days when I was working as a consultant up there, John Rigby Jones, who did a lot of those was involved in a lot of those jobs with me. So just to give him a bit of a credit for that. And then really over to you. It's I'm happy to chew over any questions. I suspect that if it's very geological, very technically geological, I probably can't give you an answer. And likewise, my memory might fade on some of the details, but I shall answer as best I can any questions you have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. I'm giving you a round of applause. You can't see it. People can unmute yourselves. So if you've got any questions, or type in the chat box and I'll read them out. We had 85 listeners, Chris.
Oh, that's very good.
Yeah,
good.
very good.
I hope it was. I hope it was interesting. I think it's one of those parts of the world, as say, you've either been up there and know it, or you've never heard of it at all. So
it's great. It's got a lot of interesting history. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Good.
Has anybody got any questions at all?
Yeah. Hi, Chris. It's Stuart here.
Hi, Stuart.
Just a quick one on part and bag of rocks. So it looks like quite a limited length of site there. Was it due to the morphology of the site, or was there a specific driving factor for it being quite localised, or are the same sort of issues being seen either side?
It was just to do with the position of it. Effectively, if you went further to the south, the slope became slacker, and there wasn't an issue. If you went further to the north, it became a much steeper and more exposed rock slope. So it was kind of an intermediate between it. So further north, there was a section of gabions at the bottom, and then there was more conventional draped rock netting because it was much steeper, and that was a bit more maintainable. It was this intermediate position of it where it had just allowed it to be accumulated. And I think at the time, the passive netting was just a bit of a something needed to be done. It wasn't really the right solution, but they'd been passive netting further along, so they thought they'd extend it to that section. That's all I can imagine, really.
Right. Okay. So are those other areas of passive netting becoming a problem as well, or are they
well,
less?
Not so much, because it was a bit more vertical. So in other words, where it was collecting, it was collecting behind these gabions or on top of them, so you could actually open the bottom of the netting and remove the material. And there wasn't so much of this thick layer of weathered material. It was much more, a rock slope really, rather than this sort of grassed over weathered area. But yeah, there are other areas with similar issues like that along the coast, but not that particular location.
Hi Chris, I've got a question. Go over here. What do they do with old sleepers at Sleeper Graveyard?
What do they do with them?
Yeah,
I honestly, they were tipped as far as I know. I don't think we use them for anything else. I mean, I might have gone away and been crushed, I suppose, but they weren't reused anywhere. No, they were just carted off as waste, unfortunately.
We've got two questions online. The first one's from Paul Stewart. Really interesting talk. Thank you, Chris. Question about how Network Rail monitor this line. Are there planned interventions before failures, or are there unidentified sudden events?
It's like lots of sections on the railway. There are areas where there are known ongoing movements where they're monitored, and therefore there is enough warning potentially to come and deal with them. But unfortunately, a lot of the failures are exactly like you've seen. They're very sudden events due to extreme events. So they're not necessarily pre-existing failures that have gone. They're washout features, so quite tricky to manage from that point of view. And the best that can be done is, as you see, to progressively, where you've got a series of problems developing or a series of small events, go ahead and then try and plan in a more major intervention to pick up those. So that is basically the process. But it is difficult because it's a long section of line. There are lots of issues, and when we were there, at least there was obviously inevitably a reasonably significant reactive element to what was being done. But progressively, Network Rail is going along and trying to renew and repair sections of seawall, etc. So it's a combination of those two things. But unfortunately, there is always going to be a chunk of things which can't really be managed. Can't really be immediately foreseen and tend to have to be picked up in terms of longer term management the slopes and drainage.
Okay, we've got another question. This one's from Erin Cullen. Hi Chris, I was wondering if there was any temporary stabilisation measures used between removing the sleepers and placing the rock armour, especially considering the rock armour must have taken some time to place with the tides.
It was done in sections is the answer to that. So there weren't any practical measures that could be done for the same reasons you've just discussed, that anything else that we tried to put in would have been as limited. So it was a question of doing it progressively, removing the material, then placing the rock armour down, with the anticipation that we shouldn't be significantly likely to be inducing a failure if you were only removing a part of it from time to time. So no, there wasn't anything other than a method of working issue.
Next question is from Fiona. Could you comment on the lifetime of the fibre reinforced concrete? Is it stainless steel fibres or polymer? Does it fail by undercutting and disruption, or by concrete degraded and eroded? Or is it the
well, I couldn't tell you the exact design life of it. It's polymer reinforced, fibre reinforced concrete. The principal way in which the problems occur is not really through the concrete degradation. It is almost all the failures you've seen there are generally to do with much more fundamental things, so undermining or the sea getting into cracks in the concrete and sort of bursting it off from that point of view. I mean, there is clearly some very poor concrete that's had to be repaired, and that's principally because it wasn't designed anywhere near marine grade. In some cases it included slag and what have you, but the principal concern is to try to ensure that the integrity of the concrete units is maintained, so that we're repairing any cracks or breaks in the concrete, we're preventing it from being undermined, etc. And that's where it tends to go. So you can repair one section and then the section next to it will go, because it's an old bit and it's the wave action gets behind it and blows bits of it off.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Chris. It's interesting talk, and it's interesting, especially a bit of detail about the concrete. Very close to my heart.
Okay, good.
Concrete.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you're interested.
Do you have any other questions for Chris? Okay, thank you, Chris. Everybody please give him a round of applause for that great talk. We'll be happy to have you again.
All right, thank you.
I've got two small announcements, so I'll just share my screen. So we've been trying to send these recorded talks to the Geological Society to upload onto their YouTube channel. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work. There's still kind of some technical glitches. So as a kind of interim, I've set up a Southeast Regional Group YouTube channel, which has the last two talks, so January's talk and February's talk, already uploaded on there. So please subscribe and share. You can obviously get onto the channel by using the QR code there, by just Googling Southeast Regional Group YouTube, or by the website, and we'll send this out as an email as well. And our next talk will be given on the 14th of April, and it is the try and read it. The Katoomba Iron Oxide Copper Gold Deposit, Zambia, application of automated quantitative mineralogy to assess a high-grade oxidized supergene ore body, and that is being presented by Dr. David Holwell from Leicester University. So please join us then. If you've got any questions, queries, qualms, please do email us and get in touch. But if not, please have a lovely evening, and we'll see you in April.
Right. Thanks, Holly. Bye now.
Thank you.
Cheers, Chris. Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris.